The email came in at 6:52 on Christmas Eve. Subject line, Notice of separation. My wife was setting the table. My daughter was arguing with the dog. And I stood in the kitchen reading a form letter that told me my 22 years were over, effective immediately, no severance. As part of a strategic restructuring. It was signed by Gerald Voss, the CEO. He hadn't even typed my name in the greeting. It just said, Dear employee. I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down on the counter, next to the potatoes, and I did something my wife didn't understand until later. I smiled. Because 3 days before that email hit my phone, I had signed a stack of papers in a lawyer's office downtown. Papers Gerald didn't know existed. Papers that meant the man who just fired me by form letter on Christmas Eve was, as of the new year, going to be working for me. He just hadn't found out yet. Let me take you back, because a moment like that only lands if you know what it cost to get there. My name is Tom Reyes. I started at Halstead Manufacturing when I was 29 years old, on the floor, running a press brake for $9 an hour. Halstead made industrial components, the kind of unglamorous parts that end up inside machines you never think about, in factories you'll never see. It wasn't a place people dreamed about. It was a place people built lives around. That's a different thing, and in some ways a better one. Walter Halstead founded the company in 1971 in a rented garage with 2 employees and a handshake reputation. By the time I got there, it was 300 people and a real plant, but Walter still walked the floor every morning. He knew names. He knew which of us had a kid in the hospital, which of us was going through a divorce, which of us just needed him to stop and say good morning like we mattered. When my second daughter was born early and spent 5 weeks in the NICU, Walter quietly told payroll to keep paying me while I sat in that hospital. I never asked. He never mentioned it. I only found out years later from a woman in accounting. That's the company I gave my life to. Over 2 decades, I worked my way up from the floor to shift lead to plant operations manager. I turned down 2 jobs that paid more because I believed in the place. I knew every machine, every supplier, every bottleneck. I knew the guys by name and I knew their families. When a rush order came in at 4 p.m. on a Friday, I was the one who figured out how to get it out the door, and I was the one who stayed until it did. I wasn't a founder. I wasn't rich. I was the kind of person a company runs on and rarely rewards. The one who holds the whole thing up from underneath while the people at the top take the credit and the bonuses. And I want to be honest with you about the resentment, because I think a lot of you know exactly what I'm talking about. For years, I watched my raises come in at 2%, while the cost of everything went up more than that. I watched my wife, Maria, work double shifts as a nurse so we could keep the mortgage current and put 2 kids through school. I watched myself get passed over for a director title 3 times, each time told I was too valuable on the floor to move up, too valuable to promote. Think about that sentence. It's the most expensive compliment a company can give you, and they hand it out for free. There's a lie working people are told their whole lives, and I believed it too long. The lie is that if you're loyal enough, valuable enough, the company will take care of you. That the relationship runs both ways. I gave Halstead my back, my knees, my Friday nights, my daughter's school plays that I missed because a shipment had to go out. And I told myself it was a partnership. It wasn't. It never is. A company is not capable of loving you back. The best of them, the ones run by a Walter, are led by people who choose to act like it does, and that choice is a gift, not a guarantee. The moment the leadership changes, you find out exactly what you always were on the balance sheet. A cost, a line item, a number waiting for someone with a red pen. I stayed anyway. Partly loyalty, partly fear, mostly Walter. As long as Walter was there, the place had a soul, and I told myself the soul was worth the salary I was leaving on the table. But Walter was getting older. Every year, he came in a little less. Every year, the gray in his walk got a little heavier. And all of us who loved the place felt the same quiet dread, the way you feel it watching a parent age, knowing that when this person goes, something is going to come for what they built. And the day Walter finally stepped back was the day the wolves smelled blood in the water. Walter didn't sell the company outright. That's important, and it's where the whole story turns. Getting older and getting tired. He brought in a board and an outside CEO to professionalize the business and let him step back from the daily grind. He kept a large ownership stake, but he handed the wheel to other people. And the person the board handed it to was Gerald Voss. Voss arrived in a charcoal suit that cost more than my monthly take-home, with a slide deck about operational excellence and a smile that never reached his eyes. He'd run divisions at bigger companies, the kind of resume that impresses a board and terrifies a floor. Within his first month, he gathered us in the break room and told us he was here to unlock value. I've been doing this long enough to know what that phrase means. It means someone in an office has decided the people who do the work are a cost, not an asset, and he's about to prove it. The changes came fast, and they came cruel. First, he froze the pension for new hires and quietly stopped matching contributions for the rest of us, burying it in a benefits memo written to be misunderstood. Then he reclassified a batch of us from hourly to salaried, which sounds like a promotion and is actually a trick. It meant the overtime we'd been earning, the extra hours that got the rush orders out, suddenly became free. Free to him. We worked the same 60-hour weeks and got paid for 40. That's not belt tightening. That's wage theft with a nicer font. And it is happening in more workplaces than you would ever believe. He went after the veterans hardest because we cost the most. A man named Frank Delaney, 31 years on the floor, the best welder I ever saw, got moved to a night shift he physically couldn't work anymore until he chose to leave 3 months short of his full pension. That wasn't an accident. That was the design. Push the expensive loyalty out the door before it can collect what it's owed and call it their decision. I watched it happen to Frank. I watched it happen to a dozen others. And I watched Gerald Voss send a company-wide email that same quarter announcing record efficiency gains, which is what you call it when you stop paying people for work they still do. The worst part wasn't the money. The worst part was watching the soul leave the building. Guys who used to whistle on the floor stopped talking. People stopped staying late, not out of laziness, but because they'd finally learned the lesson Voss was teaching. Loyalty is a debt they never intend to repay. Morale isn't a soft thing. It's the difference between a place that makes something and a place that just extracts from the people who do. Voss was extracting, and every quarter, his own bonus grew. I want to say something here to anyone listening who's living inside a version of this right now, watching a place they cared about get hollowed out by someone who calls it strategy. You are not imagining it, and you are not being dramatic. There is a specific grief in watching good work get punished and cynicism get rewarded. It makes you feel crazy because everyone in a suit keeps using calm, reasonable words for it. Efficiency, right sizing, unlocking value. Learn to hear those words for what they often are, a translation of the same old sentence. We found a way to pay you less for more, and we're proud of it. Naming the thing honestly is the first small act of taking your power back. I kept my head down and my records careful. I didn't know yet what I was going to do, but I was starting to keep a ledger. Not a real one, not yet. Just the beginning of one, in my head. of every corner cut and every promise broken. I didn't know that Ledger would one day be worth more than the company itself. Here's the thing about being the operations manager. You see the numbers. Not all of them. Not the ones locked in Voss's office, but enough. I saw the production data, the labor hours, the supplier invoices, the maintenance logs. And somewhere in Voss's second year, the numbers stopped making sense to me. It started small. A line item for consulting services that ran to $400,000 a year, paid to a firm I'd never heard of, for work I could never see the results of. I run this plant. If someone consulted on it, I'd know. Then there was the equipment. Voss reported to the board that we'd modernized 3 production lines, a multi-million-dollar capital investment. I stood on those lines every day. The machines were the same ones I'd been nursing along for a decade. The upgrades existed on paper, in a report to the board, and nowhere else on Earth. I want to be careful here, because for a long time I told myself I was wrong. That's what people like Voss count on. They count on the fact that honest people distrust their own eyes before they'll accuse someone of a crime. I didn't want to believe that the CEO of the company I'd given my life to was cooking the books. So I did what a lot of you would do. I found reasons to doubt myself. Maybe there was a contract I hadn't seen. Maybe the consulting was strategy work above my pay grade. Maybe is the word that lets thieves keep working. But I couldn't unsee the pension. That's what finally broke my doubt. Halstead had a defined benefit pension fund, an old-fashioned promise Walter had made to people like Frank that if you gave the company your working life, it would take care of you at the end of it. That fund was supposed to be protected, walled off, sacred. And in the maintenance office one afternoon, waiting on a part, I overheard 2 people from finance talking about a loan from the pension fund to cover short-term operating needs. You cannot casually borrow from a pension fund to pay the company's bills. That is not a gray area. That is people's retirements being spent to make a quarter look good, so a man in a charcoal suit can hit the target that triggers his bonus. And I understood something else that night, sitting at my kitchen table, not eating the dinner Maria had made. I understood why he'd been so comfortable doing it right in front of me. It was the same reason a pickpocket works a crowd. He'd decided I was harmless. A plant guy, boots and calluses and no MBA, no lawyer on retainer, no way to fight a man with a board behind him. My invisibility, the very thing that had cost me 3 promotions, was the thing that let him be careless around me. He signed invoices where I could see them. He talked numbers in hallways I walked. He never once imagined the furniture was reading the room. That contempt, I would learn, was the most expensive mistake of his life. But he hadn't made it yet, not fully. So I let him keep believing it. I went home that night, and I couldn't eat. Maria asked me what was wrong, and I couldn't even explain it yet, because I finally understood what I was looking at, and it was bigger and colder than mere cruelty. Cruelty is legal. What I was starting to see was not. It was the slow, deliberate looting of a company from the inside, dressed up as leadership, aimed at the very people least able to fight back. Men like Frank Delaney, who trusted a promise and gotten a night shift instead. And the man doing it had no idea that the quiet operations guy he barely acknowledged in the hallway was watching every move. Writing it all down now. For real this time. I need to tell you about the afternoon everything changed, because up until this point I was just an angry man with suspicions, and suspicions don't beat a CEO with a board behind him. What I needed was a door. Walter Halstead opened it. Walter had mostly disappeared from the plant by then. He was in his late 70s, and I'd heard he wasn't well. But that spring he came back for the retirement party of an old machinist, and I found him standing alone by the loading dock, looking at his own company like a man visiting a grave. I hadn't spoken to him in a long time. I walked over, and we talked the way you talk to someone you respect but haven't seen in years, carefully at first, and then not carefully at all. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was the look on his face. But I told him, not everything, not the numbers. I wasn't ready to accuse anyone yet. But I told him what the place had become. I told him about Frank and the night shift. I told him about the overtime that stopped getting paid, about the pension freeze, about the soul leaving the building. And Walter Halstead, who built this company with his hands in a rented garage, stood there on his own loading dock, and his eyes filled up. I trusted them with my life's work, he said. I thought I was protecting it by handing it to professionals. Then he said something I'll never forget. Tom, I made a mistake. I gave it to the wrong kind of smart. That sentence has stayed with me for the rest of my life. I gave it to the wrong kind of smart. Because that's exactly what men like Voss are. They're smart the way a lockpick is smart. Clever enough to open what isn't theirs, never wise enough to build anything worth locking. Walter had spent 50 years building something real, and he'd handed it to a man whose only genuine skill was making a spreadsheet lie. We stood there a long time. And then Walter asked me a question that turned my whole life on its axis. If you could, he said, would you run it? Not manage it. Own it. Would you take it back? I laughed, because it was absurd. I was a plant manager with a second mortgage and a retirement account you could fit in a shoebox. You don't buy a company like Halstead. That's for other people, richer people, the kind of people who wear charcoal suits. Walter looked at me and didn't laugh. I didn't ask if it was easy, he said. I asked if you would. What I didn't tell Walter that day, because I wasn't ready to say it out loud, was that a part of me was terrified of what saying yes would mean. It's a strange thing about people who've spent their lives being underestimated. You get so used to the ceiling that you start to believe you built it yourself, that it belongs there. That men like you don't own things, you just keep them running for other people. Walter's question cracked that belief, and cracking it hurt. Because if I could do this, if it was actually possible, then all those years of accepting less had been a choice I helped make. That's a hard thing to look at. It's easier, honestly, to stay small and blame the ceiling. Walter was asking me to stop blaming the ceiling and pick up a hammer. I told him yes before I understood what I was agreeing to. And on the drive home that night, my hands were shaking on the wheel, because for the first time in years I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed. It wasn't hope exactly. It was the feeling of a door that had been locked my whole life, quietly clicking open. I just had to be brave enough and reckless enough to walk through it. And I had no idea yet how much it would cost me to try. So how does a plant manager buy a manufacturing company? Let me walk you through the real mechanics, because this is the part people assume is impossible, and it isn't. It's just hard, and it requires the one thing men like Voss never expect from people like me: a plan longer than a single quarter. Walter held the key. He still owned a controlling share of the company he'd founded, more than the board and Voss's backers combined. He could sell to whoever he wanted, and he'd decided he wanted to sell to me. But wanting to sell to a man with no money is not the same as being able to. So we built the bridge, piece by piece, over 8 months of secret meetings in a diner 2 towns over, where nobody from Halstead would ever see us. First, Walter agreed to finance most of the sale himself. It's called a seller's note. Instead of demanding all the cash up front, he'd let me pay him back over years, out of the company's own profits, at a price far below what a stranger would have paid. He was leaving millions on the table on purpose, because for Walter this was never about the money. It was about who got the keys to the thing he bled for. Then I found the rest. A community bank 2 counties over, run by a man named David Okafor, who still believed in lending to people instead of algorithms, agreed to back the working capital. And a dozen senior floor workers quietly pooled their savings for small ownership stakes, so the people who built the company would finally own a piece of it. And I put in everything I had. I took a second mortgage on the house Maria, and I had spent 20 years paying down. I emptied the shoebox retirement account. I bet my family's entire security on the belief that I could run this company better and cleaner than the man who was strip mining it. Maria and I had the hardest conversation of our marriage at that kitchen table. She's a nurse. She deals in risk and consequence for a living. And she looked at me and said, "If we lose everything. And if you don't try, you'll die angry. So try." That's the moment I married her again. We structured the whole thing through a holding company, a blank little entity with a name that meant nothing, so Voss and his backers couldn't see it coming. Because make no mistake, if Gerald Voss had known Walter was selling control to the operations manager he'd been squeezing for 2 years, he'd have burned the place down to stop it. A legal challenge, a poison board, endless delay. Secrecy wasn't a game. It was the only way a man like me could ever beat a man like him. We had to close the deal before he ever knew there was a deal. I won't pretend those 8 months were anything but brutal. I'd meet Walter or David at the diner at 6, work a full day pretending nothing was happening, then go through spreadsheets at the kitchen table until midnight. There were nights I lay awake doing the math on what happens if the deal collapses, if Voss catches wind of it, if the bank pulls out, and the answer was always the same. We lose the house. We lose everything. A 50-year-old plant manager with a foreclosure and a burned bridge, starting over from nothing. That was the price of the ticket. I don't want this to sound like a man who was brave. I wasn't brave. I was terrified the entire time, and I did it anyway. That's a different thing, and I think it's the only kind of courage that's actually real. And the whole time we were building it, I was still clocking in every morning, still calling Voss Mr. Voss in the hallway, still taking his emails about efficiency, while in my briefcase sat the documents that would end him. You have never seen a man swallow so much pride so quietly. But I'd swallowed pride for 22 years. I was good at it. And now, for the first time, it had a purpose. The last stage before closing is called due diligence. It's the part where the buyer gets to open the books, all of them, the real ones, before signing. For 8 months, I'd only had suspicions, the things I could see from the floor. Now, as the buyer, with lawyers and an accountant beside me, I finally got to look inside Gerald Voss's office. And what I found was worse than I'd let myself imagine. Remember the consulting firm, the $400,000 a year for work nobody ever saw? We traced it. The firm was real in the way a coat rack is real. It had a name, an address that turned out to be a mailbox store, and a single owner, hidden 2 layers deep, who turned out to be Gerald Voss's brother-in-law. $400,000 a year of company money, for 2 years, flowing to a shell company controlled by Voss's own family, for services that did not exist. That's not aggressive management. That has a name. It's embezzlement, and it's a felony, and it was sitting right there in the invoices once you knew where to look. The Phantom equipment upgrades were the same story from a different angle. Voss had reported millions in capital improvements to the board, improvements that justified glowing performance numbers, improvements that boosted the metrics his bonus was tied to. The money had moved. The machines had not. Some of it went to the shell company. Some of it we still couldn't fully trace. But the picture was clear. He had been inflating the company's reported health to enrich himself, while gutting the actual company underneath to hide the drain. And the pension. God, the pension. It was worse than the overheard conversation. He hadn't borrowed from it once. He'd been quietly drawing it down for 2 years, papering it with IOUs from the operating account that everyone knew would never be repaid, using the retirements of men like Frank Delaney as a slush fund to keep his fiction afloat. There were people planning to retire that spring who had no idea the money they'd counted on for 40 years was already half gone, spent to make a charcoal suit look like a genius. I sat in that conference room with the accountant, a careful woman named Priya who didn't rattle easily, and I watched her go pale as the pattern came together. She looked up at me and said the sentence that changed how I understood the whole thing. Tom, this isn't just a bad CEO. This is a crime scene. And once you own this company, all of this becomes your problem to report or your problem to hide. I understood exactly what she meant. The moment I signed, I would be holding the evidence of another man's felonies. What I did with it would define what kind of owner and what kind of man I was going to be. I didn't hesitate. I told her to copy everything. Every invoice, every board report, every pension IOU, every falsified upgrade. Document it, date it, lock it down, and tell no one. Because I'd learned something a long time ago, in a plant Voss would never understand. You don't swing at a man like that with anger. You build the case so complete that when you finally lay it on the table, there is nothing left for him to say. I had the ledger now, the real one, and it was almost time. We closed the deal on December 21st, a Tuesday, in a lawyer's office downtown. With snow coming down outside the window, I signed the last of the papers and became, through that plain little holding company, the controlling owner of Halstead Manufacturing. Walter signed across from me. When it was done, he reached over and shook my hand with both of his, the way he used to shake hands on the floor 30 years ago. And he said, "You gave it back its soul before you even owned it." I had to look out the window so he wouldn't see my face. But here's the part that made the next 3 days almost unbearable. The deal was confidential until January 2nd. That was the agreement, structured that way for legal and tax reasons, and to give us time to prepare a clean transition before it went public. So on the morning of December 22nd, I put on my work boots and I drove to the plant and I clocked in. As an employee, I walked past Gerald Voss in the hallway and I said, "Morning, Mr. Voss," and he barely nodded because I was furniture to him. And in my chest sat the biggest secret of my life. I owned the floor he was standing on. I owned the office he was sitting in. I owned the chair under him. And he had no idea. I want to describe that feeling honestly because it wasn't triumphant. It was strange and heavy and almost sad. I looked at the guys on the floor, my guys, working hard for a man who was robbing them, and I wanted to tell them so badly it hurt. But I couldn't, not for 11 more days. So I did the hardest thing a person can do when they're finally holding the winning hand. I waited, calm on the outside, a storm underneath. And I thought a lot, those 3 days, about what kind of owner I wanted to be. It would have been so easy to let the anger drive, to walk into Voss's office on January 2nd and fire him in front of everyone, humiliate him the way he'd humiliated Frank, make a show of it. I understood that urge. Some of you are feeling it for me right now, but I kept coming back to Walter's words, the wrong kind of smart. I didn't want to beat Voss by becoming a smaller, meaner version of him. I wanted to beat him with the truth, cleanly, completely, in a way that helped the people he'd hurt, instead of just feeding my own satisfaction. Justice and revenge look similar from a distance. Up close, they are not the same thing at all. There's a reason I keep coming back to that distinction, justice versus revenge, and I want to be honest about it, because I don't think I'm a naturally forgiving man. I wanted revenge. Late at night, driving home, I'd imagine the look on Voss's face, and it warmed something cold in me. Anyone who tells you they wouldn't feel that is lying or has never been humiliated by someone who held power over their family. The feeling is human, but I'd watched what that feeling does to people. It had made Voss what he was, in his own way, a man so busy proving he was better than everyone that he'd forgotten to be anything else. I didn't want the win to cost me my own decency. Revenge would have felt incredible for about a week, and then it would have left me holding an angry, empty company. Justice, the slower kind, the kind that fixes the pension and pays back the overtime and puts the crime in front of a judge, that one actually rebuilds something. I chose the one that builds. It was harder. It's always harder. That's how you know it's the right one. That was my plan for January 2nd. A quiet meeting, the documents on the table, a clean and lawful transfer of power, and then the long work of making things right. That was the plan. Gerald Voss had a different plan. And on the evening of December 24th, without knowing what he was doing, he pointed the gun directly at his own foot and pulled the trigger. Here is what Gerald Voss did on Christmas Eve, and I only understood the full ugliness of it later. His year-end bonus was tied to headcount reduction. He'd promised the board a certain amount of cost savings by December 31st, and he was short. So he decided to hit his number the cheapest, coldest way a person can. He drew up a list of the most senior, most expensive employees left in the building, the ones closest to their pensions, and he fired all of us by automated email on Christmas Eve, time for a holiday weekend so none of us could reach HR, react, or fight back until after the deadline had passed and his bonus had locked in. There were 11 of us on that list. 11 people with, between us, over 200 years of service to that company. Men and women who'd built the place. And we all got the same Dear Employee letter at the same minute, while we were with our families on the one night of the year that's supposed to be safe. He didn't call. He didn't have the decency to use our names. He timed it so we'd be alone with the news. That's not a business decision. That's cruelty engineered for maximum efficiency, which, when you think about it, is the only thing Gerald Voss was ever actually good at. I found out later how the others took it that night, and it's the part that still puts a stone in my chest. A woman named Carol, 26 years in shipping, read hers standing at her mother's kitchen sink and didn't tell her family until the presents were opened the next morning because she didn't want to ruin their Christmas. A younger guy, Dev, who'd just bought his first house on the strength of that job, sat in his car in the driveway for an hour before he could go inside and tell his wife. Voss never thought about any of that. To him, we were a spreadsheet cell that turned from red to black the instant he hit send. You gotta feel efficient. We gotta feel like the years we gave meant nothing. And here's what the powerful never understand about that particular wound. It doesn't make people weaker. It burns something clean and hard into them. It turns a workforce into witnesses. Every one of those 11 people became a person who would, someday, be very glad to tell the truth about Gerald Voss. I need to speak to you directly for a second, because if you've come this far in the story, I suspect you've been on the receiving end of something like that letter. Maybe not on Christmas Eve, but the version life handed you. The cold dismissal. The years of loyalty answered with a form. The moment you realized the institution you gave yourself to never saw you as a person at all. I know that feeling, and I know how it can make you doubt your own worth. If you've made it this far with me, I want to invite you to subscribe to our channel and join us every day. Because the whole reason I tell these stories is to remind you of something the Gerald Vosses of the world need you to forget. Your dignity was never theirs to fire. And sometimes the very moment they think they've beaten you is the moment they've handed you everything. Because think about what Voss had just done, though he didn't know it. He had, in writing, on a documented company system, illegally terminated 11 senior employees to manipulate a year-end bonus. 3 days after ownership of the company had legally transferred to one of the very people he was firing. Me. He had just wrongfully terminated his own new boss, on the record, with a timestamp, as the final entry in a 2-year pattern of fraud I already had fully documented. I stood in my kitchen on Christmas Eve, holding that phone, and the anger I expected didn't come. Instead, there was a clarity so complete it was almost peaceful. He had just written the last line of his own case file, and he'd signed it. I let him have his Christmas. I want you to know that. I didn't call a lawyer that night, didn't send a triumphant reply, didn't ruin the holiday for his family the way he'd tried to ruin mine. I ate dinner with Maria and my daughters. I told them it was going to be okay, that in fact it was going to be more than okay, and I asked them to trust me for 9 more days. Then I went to bed, and for the first time in 2 years, I slept all the way through the night. Those 9 days between the firing and the meeting were the strangest of my life. I went to my daughter's Christmas pageant. I fixed the leak under the bathroom sink I'd been ignoring for a month. I let Maria think, most of the time, that I was as calm as I looked, though she knew me too well to fully buy it. And every so often, doing something ordinary, I'd remember what was coming and feel this quiet electric current run through me. Not glee, something steadier. The feeling of a man who has spent his whole life being told to wait his turn, finally holding the thing he was told he'd never hold, and choosing to hold it gently. I'd earned the right to be loud on January 2nd. I decided I wasn't going to be. That decision was the last piece of armor I put on. On January 2nd, I drove to the plant in the dark, before the shift, the same drive I'd made 10,000 times. But I didn't clock in. I went up the stairs to the executive floor, where in 22 years I'd rarely been invited, and I waited in the conference room with Priya the accountant, David from the bank, and our lawyer. At 8:15, Gerald Voss walked in for what he'd been told was a routine ownership update meeting. He was annoyed. He had a coffee in one hand and his phone in the other. He saw me sitting at the head of the table in my work clothes, and his first reaction wasn't fear. It was irritation. "Reyes," he said, "you don't work here anymore. You need to leave before I call security." I didn't answer right away. I looked at him, this man in his charcoal suit who had never once, in 2 years, asked me a single question about my life. I thought about all the mornings I'd said good morning to him and gotten silence. I thought about Frank in his kitchen and Carol at her mother's sink and Dev in his driveway. And I felt the strangest thing. Not hatred, a kind of pity, almost, for a man about to learn how completely he'd misread the room he'd been standing in for 2 years. Then I gestured to the empty chair across from me, the way Walter used to gesture to a chair, and I said, "Sit down, Gerald. There's been a change in ownership. I think you'll want to hear it sitting down." I let the silence sit for a moment. Then our lawyer slid a single document across the table. The transfer of ownership, executed December 21st. Gerald picked it up. I watched his eyes move across it, and I watched the exact instant the words stopped being words and became a wall he'd just run into at full speed. He read it again, because people always read it again, as if the truth might rearrange itself if you look hard enough. Then he looked up at me, And for the first time in 2 years, Gerald Voss actually saw me. Not the furniture in the hallway. Me. As of December 21st, I said, and I kept my voice as flat and calm as his firing email. I own the controlling interest in this company, which means on the evening of December 24th, when you terminated me and 10 other senior employees by automated email to manipulate your bonus, you were, technically, firing your own employer. I let that land. So no, Gerald, I don't think I'll be leaving, but you might want to sit down, because that document is the good news in your morning. He sat. He sat the way a man sits when his legs make the decision for him. And then I opened the folder. I laid it out the way Priya had assembled it, in order, without raising my voice, because the facts didn't need help from me. The consulting invoices to his brother-in-law's shell company. $800,000 over 2 years, for nothing. The falsified equipment upgrades reported to the board to inflate performance and trigger his own bonuses. And the pension. The retirements of men like Frank Delaney, drawn down and papered over with IOUs he never intended to honor, spent to keep his fiction alive. I put each document on the table as I named it, and I watched a man who had spent 2 years being the smartest one in every room discover that he wasn't. Gerald Voss didn't yell. Men like him rarely do when the paper is real. He got very quiet, and then he tried the only move he had left. He tried to negotiate. Tom, he said, and it was the first time he'd ever used my first name. We're both businessmen. There's a version of this where everyone walks away clean. I almost admired the reflex. Even then, drowning, he was reaching for a deal. I told him no, not cruelly, just completely. I told him that the board would be presented with everything that afternoon, that the pension fund would be independently audited and every dollar restored, out of the company's resources and out of the personal assets we'd be pursuing from him, that the 11 of us he'd fired on Christmas Eve were reinstated as of that morning, with back pay, and that every worker who'd had overtime stolen through his reclassification trick would be made whole, going back to the day he started it, and that the complete file, the embezzlement, the falsified reports, the rated pension, was already in the hands of our attorney and would be referred to the district attorney and the Department of Labor by the end of the week. He tried one more thing before the end, and I think about it sometimes because of what it revealed. He looked at me and he said, "You'll never be able to run this place without me. You don't have the sophistication. You'll drive it into the ground in a year." Even then, cornered, holding nothing, he reached for the only weapon he'd ever really had, the lie that people like him are necessary and people like me are not. I almost laughed, because I'd been running that plant for years while he took the credit. The machines ran because of me. The orders shipped because of me. The only thing Gerald Voss had ever run was a spreadsheet full of fiction. I told him that, plainly, without heat. And I watched the last of the performance drain out of his face, because on some level he'd always known it too. Then I said the only personal thing I allowed myself the whole meeting. "You fired Frank Delaney 3 months short of his pension and called it his choice. You fired 11 people on Christmas Eve so you could hit a number. You did it because you were sure people like us would never be in a position to do anything about it. That was your one real mistake. Not the fraud, the contempt." And I stood up because there was nothing left to say, and because a man in my position doesn't need the last word. The documents were the last word. Security walked Gerald Voss out of the building he thought he ran at 9:40 in the morning, carrying a cardboard box, past the floor where the guys had already heard, where Lewis and the crew stood at their machines and watched him go without a single word. Nobody cheered. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was quieter and better than cheering. It was the silence of people who had been told, for 2 years, that they didn't matter, watching the proof that they did. Gerald Voss was indicted 11 months later. The embezzlement was too clean to fight, laid out in his own invoices and his own reports. He took a plea, paid back what could be recovered, and lost the career his charcoal suit had been the costume for. I didn't go to the hearing. I'd stopped needing to watch by then. Some justice you have to witness. The best kind you can simply trust to arrive. The pension was made whole. That's the part I'm proudest of. Every dollar Voss drained was restored, and the people who'd trusted a promise for 40 years got to retire on it after all. I drove out to Frank Delaney's house myself to tell him. 31 years that man gave the floor, pushed out 3 months short by a night shift designed to break him. I sat in his kitchen and told him his full pension was reinstated and his early departure reversed on the record. Frank, who I'd never once seen cry in 3 decades, put his face in his hands at his own table. That drive home was the best hour of my working life. Halstead Manufacturing is still here, smaller than Voss's fiction claimed, more solid than his reality ever was. The overtime gets paid. The pension is protected by people who understand it's a promise, not a piggy bank. A dozen of the men and women who work the floor own a piece of the place now, and they walk different because of it. Walter lived to see 1 full year of it before he passed. Near the end, he told me the company finally felt like his again. I told him it never stopped being his. It just found its way home. I think about that Christmas Eve email more than you'd guess. Not with anger anymore. Because Gerald Voss spent 2 years certain that people like me existed to be used and discarded furniture in his hallway. He was so sure of it that he fired me by form letter and didn't even use my name. He never imagined the quiet man running his plant might be running a much longer game. That's the mistake the powerful keep making. They confuse your patience for weakness. They confuse your silence for consent. So if you're out there tonight holding your own version of that email, feeling discarded, remember something. The people who underestimate you are handing you the only advantage that really matters. Let them. Keep your records. Keep your dignity. Choose your moment. And when it comes, don't shout. Just open the folder. If this story meant something to you, follow the channel and share it with 5 people who need to hear it tonight. Leave a comment about the moment you were counted out and what you did next. And if there's a story you want to see told here, put it below. I read every one. There's always another kept ledger, another folder waiting for the right morning.